Open Windows Podcasts. A venture of HitTheRoad Cultural Journeys. A journey in time to music and the arts for your enjoyment and enrichment. Presented by Orhan Ahıskal, DMA, solo violinist and former professor of violin and chamber music. Hi everybody, today we are talking about Dendrochronology. Yes, you heard it right, it's Dendrochronology. You have no idea? Well, you will find out about it now. I have a very dear friend of mine as my guest today, violin maker, a master violin maker, Arjan Versteeg. And you actually met Arjan's wife when we talked about violin making. That was my first podcast actually that I put out there today. But we're not talking about violin making, but this new, well, it's not so new, I understand, but it's this technique, let's call it, called Dendrochronology. And Arjan will inform us about this thing. And I found it very interesting, and I'm sure you will enjoy it very much, so stay tuned. So, Arjan, you're a violin maker. You studied first in the Netherlands, where you come from, and then you have a degree from the Mittenwald Violin Making School. And then you took all the exams to become a master violin maker. Violin maker, I mean all string instruments, of course. It's not just the violin. So now we are at the Versteeg's workshop in Hohenschönlein. This is just to the south of Munich. So Arjan, well, thank you so much for joining me today. We are wondering about Dendrochronology. What is Dendrochronology?
Yes, hello Orhan. Nice to have you here in our workshop.
Great to see you again too.
Yes.
Thanks.
Well, Tenor Chronology is a technique to date wood.
Wood?
Yes,
Okay.
and violins and all string instruments are made of wood, of course. And the dating of the wood is very important to be sure the wood is old enough the violin can be made by a violin maker, like Stradivari, and that's the most famous violin maker, of course. It's important to date the wood because that's actually the only scientific method to say something about the genuinity of an instrument.
Okay, whether an instrument is genuinely by Stradivari, for example.
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, Dendrochronology is based on the rings of wood. The trees grow in rings. Every piece of wood you see the annual rings. And every year the tree makes a ring. So the tree is growing every year and it starts in spring. Then the tree makes a little bit wood and the outer ring underneath the bark.
Okay,
I'm
yeah.
not sure
So it's like one ring every year. That's inside the bark, of course.
Yes, okay. And well, it starts in the spring with some softwoods. It's mostly wider than in the autumn, in the winter.
Okay.
And then in the winter it makes a pause. It makes a winter sleep. So there's no growing in the tree. And in the next year it starts again. And that's why you see the rings. And every year the tree makes a ring, and the ring is made underneath the bark.
So it's not something we see outside. There's the skin of the tree, the bark.
Yes.
And then there's the ring.
And the ring width is caused by climatic situation of the tree in that year. So you can imagine if it's very warm and very humid, then the ring is a little bit larger, as in the year it's very dry and cold. And this makes a pattern, and this pattern is unique in time. And you can imagine the rings in the table of the table is the top of the violin has about 60 to 200 rings, and that makes a sequence of ring width that is unique in time. And if you have a large database, you can compare these sequences which you have measured with the database, and then you can say this annual ring is grown in the year, say, 1650 or something like that.
Okay, it's about finding the width of the rings and then matching it to a database that already exists.
Yes.
How far back does that database go?
Well, I'm specialized in the spruce because the table of the violins and cellos are made of spruce. And my database goes back to 1199. That's the oldest ring I ever measured.
1199?
Yes. And
but there was no violins at the time, so what kind of this wood was used for what?
It was used for a viola da gamba, which is presented in the museum in Vienna. And it is a very old viola da gamba. It was made in 1550, but it's a very large sequence. So we start with I think the youngest year was about 1500. It was a large viola da gamba. The sequence was very large, and it goes back 200 annual rings. So you can count back from 1500 to
1300.
1300, yes.
So when they made the viola da gamba in 1500s, the tree was already 400 years old. You're saying, if it or like
no, it was about 300 years old. Yes.
300 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, that says much about my mathematical skills. So about from the year 1200 to 1500s, more than 300 years. So when was this tree cut?
The tree was cut any time after 1500, because the ring I dated, the last ring in the instrument was dated 1500.
How do you know that? I mean, how do you know that that's the last ring when you see it?
Because there are no more rings, and the last ring in the tree is always the ring underneath the bark.
That's how you can tell. Okay.
Yes,
so
but there is no bark in an instrument, of course. They cut the bark away, so you have to add some rings, some annual rings, some years, to get the earliest possible manufacturing date.
Below the bark, inside the bark, so several rings, let's say 3-4 years are cut, you're saying?
Yes.
And that's when the tree was cut, basically. So you can date the latest ring on an instrument or on a piece of wood is, of course, when the tree was cut. So how do you know that that's the date that tree was cut? Where do you match that?
Well, I match it with my database, and then I can date the rings. But if I don't have the bark, I can't say when exactly the tree was cut. But of course, I know the date of every annual ring.
So in the database, you can basically see for each year how wide a tree ring would be approximately.
Yes.
That how the database works?
Yes, the ring width has to be very similar to my database so I can date it. And it is not just one ring, it is a sequence of rings. That's important to notice. Just one ring width doesn't say very much, but if you have about 60 or 100 or 200 rings in a sequence of ring width, that's unique, and you have to find a similar pattern in the database so you can match it. It has to fit in the
Okay, so the more rings you have, the better chance of actually really placing the date of the tree, how old it was, and when it might have been cut, basically. Even if you don't know when exactly it was cut, you can still see that it goes back to, as you said, like 1199. Because we know exactly, let's say in the year 1725, the weather was like that, but then it has to be a certain geographical region. I mean, the weather was different in the Alps from, let's say, some mountains in North America or in China.
Yes, it's also important that to know where the tree grew, but the spruce used for musical instruments always grow in the Alps or some other mountains in Europe. So the region
it has to be high.
Yeah, it has to be a specific altitude, like about 1,200 meters and more. That's the best wood for the soundboards, the table, or the top for instrument making. Yes.
Why is that?
Well, the rings are then very narrow and very regular. And that's important for stability and for acoustical reasons.
It's because if a tree grows above 1,200 meters, it's constantly below or above certain temperature. So every year the tree ring the width of the ring is not very different from the years previous.
Yes, and they are very narrow because it's almost a little bit colder in the mountains and less rain. So it's it's a harder climate for the trees, and that's why they grow a little bit slower, and that's better for the sound.
So the harder the climate where the tree grows, the better for the wood, basically, you're saying,
Yes.
because it doesn't just grow very big in a short period of time. So when you cut it, it's stronger. How does that affect the instrument? Why is it important that the tree is actually stronger for the instrument making, or at least the string instrument making?
Well, one thing is you can make the plates, the top of the violin, a little bit thinner, and they are less heavy. That's better for the sound, and you don't get many cracks if the wood is very regular and with very narrow grain.
Okay, that explains why all of these instruments, 200-300 years old, actually survive to this day, because they have been made with these strong and more durable wood,
Yes.
and that wood comes from higher planes, you're saying. And I remember, because also it's not very, so there's not much soil maybe, so the tree has to grow on the rocks. There's very little soil, so the tree doesn't grow very big very quickly, but it makes the wood stronger. That's what I understand.
Yes.
Okay, so, and the dating, so you were just talking about, like in Europe, instrument makers used trees that were cut in higher places, and then that's, of course, in Central Europe, that's all around the Alps. In order to date the tree, then it has to come from a certain region. Like in Europe, most of the trees, at least in Central Europe, they grow in higher altitudes on the Alps. Yeah, it's like Mittenwald is right at the northern edge of the northern outskirts of the Alps, and obviously Stradivari in Cremona must have, or Amati, they must have gotten their violins in the Alps of northern Italy, basically. But in other places, then how does it work? Like if you find an instrument that was made with a tree that doesn't come from the Alps,
Well, then we have a problem most of the time.
you have a problem.
Yes,
Okay.
but Mittenwald is a good example, I think, because that's actually how you can start, or how I started the database. Is you see the section of a tree over there.
Okay.
That's a spruce, and it's a large stem. The tree was cut in 2010, and the outermost ring is the ring that grew in 2010.
Okay, so I'm holding this like half an orange sliced kind of big tree on my left, and that's approximately, I would say, in centimeters, 70 centimeters in diameter, so that's about 25 inches or so, let's say. So you're saying that, because the tree was cut in 2010, so that means basically right below the bark on the outer rim, so that's the latest year, 2010.
Yes.
But it's not just only counting like what we know, of course, how you count the rings and you say this is how old the tree is, but you are actually saying that each ring's width helps you to basically match it to an existing measurements or a sequence of measurements of the rings. Therefore, once you match it, even if you don't have the bark or what's under it, you can say at least this section of the tree certainly dates from a given date. That's like almost a given. You can easily say that.
Yes.
But for the spruce,
Of
not
course,
for all kinds of trees.
you have to do it with the same kind of tree. If you mix the trees, it won't work. But if you stay with one species, and I stay with spruce because that's the wood which is used for violin making, then
It's
it
the most
works.
common wood in that way for the instruments, or at least the upper plates.
Yes, for the soundboards, for pianos, and for the soundboards or the plates for violins.
So this could also be for the piano, that you can use the same technique
Yes.
to date the instrument. Let's say that some of our listeners have instruments, they think it might be Stradivari, because that happens a lot, because I just found an instrument, it says Stradivari, I'm going to be rich, that's very common, that story I've heard a lot. Like, I remember my pianist came from Bologna, so we had a bunch of recitals in Italy, and she had a friend who had found a little violin case behind the curtain in her grandparents' apartment when they died, and it said Stradivari in it. So they thought, oh, okay, but they were so afraid to take it to somebody qualified. Like they actually were afraid to take it to a violin maker because they didn't trust the violin making community. They didn't want to take it there because if somebody replaced the instrument, like they wouldn't realize the instrument would have been replaced. So they asked me to look at it. I said, look, I'm not an expert to say like this instrument dates from or this is a real Stradivari. But so it's a very common story. People have this idea or fantasy, let's call it, to find a Stradivari instrument because it's very expensive. But you can actually say if an instrument was made by Stradivari or not. How do you do that? You actually made, let me actually add, your first project, I remember reading, was about a whole Stradivari violin catalog.
Yes, I did a research project on Stradivari violins. That was about 320 Stradivari instruments, and I was ordered to date the wood of the instruments.
So you dated the wood of 320 Stradivari violins?
Yeah, Stradivari cellos and violins, yes, and some violas also, but most of the instruments were violins, and it was of course because it was for a large book that was published to show all Stradivari instruments, but they wanted to be sure it was really Stradivari, and therefore they asked to do the dendrochronological analysis so that they could say the wood is old enough that the violin could be made by Stradivari. Of course, you have to be an expert to see the stylistics on a violin to say it's typical Stradivari, but a scientific method or a scientific technique is the dendrochronology, so you can prove the wood is old enough that Stradivari was able.
He could have made it because that wood is as old as Stradivari's life. Like you have how many rings here? I'm looking. Can you tell me how many rings I am seeing here on this big
I think it was about 180 rings.
180 rings and about, it's like a small pizza kind of thing. So 180 years at least this tree was old.
Mm-hmm.
So you can say if the tree actually even existed when Stradivari was alive, therefore yes, whether he made it or he couldn't have possibly made an instrument from this tree, because by the time he died, this tree was still like living basically.
Yes, and growing.
Growing. That's fascinating, but also another fascinating thing is that you basically had to. Did you see all of these instruments? 320 instruments by Stradivari.
Yeah, not all of them. Some I got to analyze, but you can make the measurements with high resolution photographs. If you make pictures with a special camera, with a special lens, then you can make the measurements on the screen of a computer, and you can make the measurements of the rings. And so I did most of the measurements based on photographs which were sent to me, and because I had so much Stradivari
experience, I guess.
Experience, so much Stradivari instruments in my database, I could see that many instruments were made from the same tree.
You could even say that this is the same tree that these, how many instruments? Like you said, how many instruments were made from the same tree?
Oh, I have one tree which I can prove more than 20 violins were made from. And
20 violins from the same tree.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very economical, I guess.
Yes, I think it is always better to make more instruments from one tree, because otherwise Stradivari had to cut
so many trees.
Yes, a whole forest.
So he was actually environmentally friendly then?
Yes.
Okay.
There was also another story. The most famous Stradivari violin is the Messiah violin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you heard about the Messiah.
I heard about the Messiah, but okay.
Well, it's exhibited in Oxford in the Ashmolean Museum, and that's a very beautiful violin, but most of the time people weren't sure if it was made by Stradivari, because it looks like
brand new. That's
brand
right.
new. It's like fresh from the workbench, so to say. And there were a lot of people thinking it's not true. It was made by Jean-Baptiste Vuillaume. It's a French violin maker in Paris in the 1900s. And
Is because Viom actually copied earlier masters, I guess, and really well. I mean, Viom violins are very famous and good.
yes,
But it was not original, like you can say, well, this is, like he pretended that was a Stradivari violin, yeah? So he actually made a copy of Stradivari Instruments, or the model.
he used
Is
the
that
model,
right?
but he made also copies, and sometimes they are really good. You have to look very precise that you see that's not a Stradivari or a Guarneri or something like that. But he also copied the Messiah violin, and therefore people thought this violin, which is in Oxford in the museum, is also made by Jean-Baptiste Viom. And he was a good maker, and he probably could made some copies which are now played by musicians who think it's a Stradivari or something like that.
So that basically confirms that it is not a Viom instrument, but it's most likely by Stradivari. You mentioned that people, because they think doesn't look very old. Why does it not look very old, the Messiah?
Well, the Messiah was bought by Viom from Tarisio.
That's an instrument dealer.
That was an instrument dealer, and I'm not sure where he bought it, but it was he said the most beautiful violin ever existed, and therefore he never played really on it, and nobody played on it, and the violin is called Messiah because the Tarisio was a dealer, and he was often going to Paris, to Viom and some other dealers, and he thought, I have the most beautiful violin ever seen. And then son-in-law of Viom told him, well, it's like the Messiah. You always talk about him, but he never comes. And that's why the violin was called Messiah violin. Okay.
And then, even then, it was barely played, so it didn't really age. The varnish looks very new.
Yes, but and you see it. It looks like a really new violin if you see it in the museum. It is very fascinating. And some people said it must sounded very badly because it wasn't played. But some people like Joseph Joachim, yes, played on it and said it was a very nice violin. And yes, and
what a shame in a way. I mean, a violin made by Stradivari, nobody really played.
Yes, but for historian and for violin makers, it is very interesting because you can see the working method of Stradivari. And you see the varnish, how it's put on the instrument. It's not polished very much. It's a kind of mint condition. So you see how Stradivari worked.
Great story, thank you.
Okay, but if I worked in Munich with a violin maker, I got an instrument on my workbench to polish or to make some repairs. And in that time I was also working on my database, so every instrument I saw I made pictures and measured the rings. And this was a very nice instrument made by Rogeri. Yeah, Pietro Giacomo Rogeri. It's not from Cremona where Stradivari is from, but he's from Brescia. And I made the measurements of the annual rings, and then I put it in my database, and the computer was calculating, and then I saw it's almost exact the same ring width like the Messiah Stradivari violin. So it must be from the same tree. The
same tree,
Messiah Stradivari, and this violin made by Pietro Giacomo Rogeri.
So basically they had a single distributor of these trees who gave some to Cremona and then sold some to Brescia, basically.
Yes, I think so. It must be like this. And actually it's the same nowadays, because if you go to a tone wood dealer, then most of the time you don't buy the full tree, but maybe one part of the tree, and the other part is bought by another violin maker. Somebody, maybe.
Well, because I know some violin makers in Turkey, and I remember they said, I get my wood from Mittenwald. So what you're saying is exactly true. So it could be two different violins made by completely different, in different places and different makers, but they could be made from the same tree, obviously. And that was also true in the early 1700s, basically.
Yes.
That's a very interesting subject. So you have your database, you said, goes back to 1199. And I remember we talked about the history of Dendrochronology. So what is Dendrochronology? You said it's the dating of the wood, but it comes from Greek word of
Yes, the Greek words are dendron, that's wood, chronos, that's the time, and logos, that's the scientific method or logic.
Of explaining something.
Of explaining
so, dendron, anything to do with wood, basically, yeah, dendron.
Yes.
Okay, Dendrochronology.
Yes. And the technique was invented by an American in the 1910s, 1920s, to prove that the sun has spots every 11 or 7 years, and then the trees should have been more narrow rings. That was his intention. And then they saw the technique was very useful for dating archaeological sites. And the technique of dendrochronology is very often used for dating dendrochronological artifacts or archaeological artifacts. And the databases of oak, for instance, go back in time 10,000 years BCE.
Wow.
And they can date Celtic villages or Viking boats.
They can date boats? Okay.
Yeah, they take boats, yes. And it's of course it's very important because you can, if you find a piece of the bark, then you can be sure it's cut in that year. There's no plus minus. It's exactly that year the tree was cut. And even if you see if it's the last ring in the underneath the bark, below the bark, is made in spring or in autumn, so you can date exactly the cutting date of a tree within a half a year, something like that.
Okay, so it's very, very precise, really.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there could be people who have instruments and maybe they believe it was made by Stradivari or some other Italian maker or German maker, and they can actually contact you and they can send you very high resolution photos. They don't have to be even coming here to your workshop. If they live in Central Europe or they can travel, I would certainly recommend for them to come here. But they can contact you through your webpage. That's www.versteeg, so Versteeg minus or hyphen
yes.
Geigenbau.
So, GEIGENBAU.de.
So Germany, Deutschland.
Yeah.
And they can easily contact you through the webpage. And if they send, this is important, that the pictures that you would have to send should be or would have to be taken by a digital camera, not a cell phone, and would have to be really as high as possible resolution so that the ring widths are easily visible, and also of course it should be in very good focus. So any blurry picture will not do, basically.
Yes, that's true. I have to magnify it on the screen, and then I have to make very precise measurements. So
of each ring.
Of each ring, yes.
And match it to your database, and then you can say, well, this tree certainly. But it also has to be a spruce. So
yes, it's only the top of the violin or of the cello. The back is made of maple, and that's a difference. It's a tree with leaves, and it's not working. The dendrochronological technique is not working.
Because it's too variable, I guess. It could be similar to different periods.
Yeah, it's too variable for the location. If the tree is very near to a river, the tree has a lot of water, and he doesn't notice that's a dry year. The weather is very...
so even if it didn't rain that year, the tree has enough water so that it grows again enough to say, so it could be, okay?
Yeah.
Well, that's very interesting. So it has to be spruce, so it has to be the upper plate, the table of string instruments. Oh. Well, Arjan, thank you so much. This was very interesting.
You're welcome.
So if you'd like to find Arjan, as we explained, you can go to their webpage and find out more about the chronology. Also, you can contact Arjan for him to date your instruments. Thank you very much for your time today.
You're
I found that very, very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome, Arjan.
Bye-bye. Thank you for joining me today at another Open Windows podcast of Hit the Road Cultural Journeys. Hit the Road is an artistic and educational project that has evolved and been developed in the last 30 years artistically to promote solo violin works that are rarely or never performed, also to educate audiences about different aspects of Western classical music. And we value your support. Please consider supporting Hit the Road cultural journeys and become a valued member of Hit the Road Inner Circle. Visit our page at patreon.com, type Hit the Road, and watch our introductory video. You can support this project then by choosing a membership level and with your small monthly contributions. Hit the Road needs you. Until next time, all the best.